AI. So I am super excited. Oh, Yika's raising her hand.
Yeah, I must switch the sound. So my suggestion is that all attendees of the summer school can send you the email addresses and they can be the guests of the summer school channel in Slack. And it will be accessible only to the participants of the school if you wish to share
cool.
something. Because the participants of the full conference, they have the access, but if it is someone who is not the participant of the conference, they can attend just one channel of Slack. So send me the emails then. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, if you want to be added to the summer school channel of the conference Slack, send me your email and I'll pass it along to Yika, or just send Yika your email, I guess. And we can get you added and we can post the chat there as well. Okay, great. So yeah, next up we have Lana's talk. I'm super excited for it. Yeah, if you're part of the conference Slack already, you can add yourself. If you're not part of the conference Slack, then you'll need to email us your email. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen.
Yes, I just want to say this is a pre-recorded talk, so while you're listening, you can ask questions and I will try to answer in the chat.
Awesome, sounds good. So yeah, we'll keep this great discussion going.
Hi, I'm Lana, and I enjoy trying to convince AI researchers to do ALife. First, let me tell you a bit about myself. I started my life as a researcher by doing good old-fashioned AI. You choose a task, you have an idea about how the task should be solved, you define a mathematical model, and you put that model into a device, whether it's a robot, a computer, or a mobile phone. My first ALife project was quite different. We took some rats' neurons, mixed them up, put them inside a robot, and tried to see what kind of task we could teach that robot. I worked on the simulation side, and my job was to find how to convince the network to learn something without a reward. You can already see that there is quite a difference. We didn't start with the task, and we didn't know how the neurons worked. This is the kind of research that I do now. I try evolving visual illusions, I try to recreate the tree of life from scratch, or I put parasites in cellular automata to make them grow a third eye. Now you might notice that there is no immediate application to this kind of project, and you might wonder if there is even a point to doing this kind of research. My goal with this talk is to convince you that doing AI with the flavor of ALife can give you a broader starting point and at the same time be more relevant. So why did I go from doing concrete engineering projects to doing the more abstract type of ALife research? There are several reasons. I think everyone has their own reasons and these were mine. The first reason is that I don't want to tell my AI how to do things. This is not a controversial view anymore. Most people just specify the task, what the AI should do, and we don't tell it how to do it. But I also don't really want to tell my AI what to do. Ideally, it would just surprise me. I find that way more interesting. Another reason, and I know I'm in the minority with this, but I don't care that much about human intelligence. I'm way more interested in other kinds of intelligence, including alien intelligence. Actually, one of my current projects, in collaboration with NASA, is to try to find alien life. And there are many more pragmatic reasons, including the fact that I don't want to do what everyone else is doing. Partly because I want to be original, and partly because I don't like strong competition. I would rather be in my own space with a few people doing our own thing. Shameless promotion. If you two are more interested in collaborating than in competing, please become a beta user of my open collaboration platform called Mimosa. Just contact me at this email address. For the main part of the talk, let's start with some basics. Artificial life, also known as ALife, has three main subfields, to which I would add a fourth, art. First, we have wet ALife, where the philosophy is that we know one example of life, and so the fastest way to make artificial life is to use live stuff and combine it in new ways. Hard ALife doesn't use the physical components of life, but they know that the real world might still be your best bet to try to evolve a new life form. Hard ALife is at a different scale than wet ALife. If you do wet ALife, you're probably at a micro scale, or at least a pretty small scale. If you want to work with bigger components, you have to go to hard ALife. Everything that is robotics belongs to hard ALife. Now soft ALife, which is where most of AI belongs. We try to make life in made-up worlds with made-up parts, which is of course much more convenient than dealing with the real world and all its noise, but you can probably see the danger here. We have the risk of becoming irrelevant. If you use toy tasks in toy models, there is no guarantee that whatever you find will be related to real life. But in a way, that's also a good point, because you're not limited by real life. Nothing says that we can't have life in a world that is completely made up with different dimensions and different laws. AI is mostly in soft ALife, but not only. In the rest of this talk, I will explain why AI should care about ALife and why ALife should care about AI. I will also talk about the difference between ALife flavored AI and deep learning. And finally, I will present some big open questions in this field and give some examples of papers. Speaking of papers, if you want to keep up with new published ALife papers, please follow this Twitter account, ALife Papers. We are also looking for volunteers to help curate the content. I talked a bit about why do ALife if you're an AI researcher. I would also like you to imagine the opposite. Imagine you're an ALife researcher. Why are some good reasons to do AI? The first reason is that life and intelligence aren't that different. They are very close phenomena. One of the most important aspects of life is adaptation. Finding solutions to problems, getting used to new environments, making the best of what you have. Intelligence is also about adaptation and finding solutions to problems and adapting to new environments. If you're interested in life, you should also be interested in intelligence and vice versa. Or you could take the opposite point of view. Intelligence is only a property of life. We don't know examples of intelligence without life. And I could also argue that anywhere there is life, there is also intelligence. So what better way to prove that you've built artificial life than to prove that you've evolved intelligence? Intelligence and life are linked. Any advance we can make in one field will resonate in the other. If you ignore one, you risk missing the big picture. Finally, if you're not interested in AI because you don't like neural networks, you don't have to work with neural networks. You can do AI without neurons and even without brains. Not your uncle's deep learning. First, why did I say uncle here? Well, deep learning is not a baby anymore. It matured very fast and now it's a grown-up. But somehow it's still cool. It's not easy for a mature field to continue to attract young researchers. And deep learning managed to do that. So deep learning is a bit like your cool uncle. Here is an exchange that I saw on Twitter, and if I could, I would give those guys an Ig Nobel Prize, because this made me laugh, and then it made me think. First guy says, life evolves on a planet where survival depends foremost on doing correct completion of text snippets. Is the end result intelligent? He's of course referring to the fact that a lot of deep learning deals with text completion. Do we really want to call this intelligence? And the other guy says, life evolves on a planet where survival depends foremost on doing correct completion of shape rotation. He is referring to IQ tests. A big part of your IQ score will depend on Raven matrices, where you have to rotate shapes in your head. There are two ways you can take this. The first is, well, obviously survival on Earth doesn't depend on this, but that's how we measure intelligence. So maybe we don't have to optimize for intelligence to get intelligence. The other way to say this is that IQ tests don't actually measure intelligence, and so I don't know what we're measuring, but maybe we should focus on something that is more relevant to life. Here are two archive searches side by side. On the right, I search for neural network, and on the left you have artificial life. If you look at the results, neural network research is mostly focused on applying deep learning to engineering problems, while the results for ALife are more diverse and mostly don't even mention deep learning or any kind of application. One of the reasons for this difference is that deep learning is in an exploitation phase, and ALife is still in exploration. Both phases have pros and cons, but ideally you would have a balance of the two. Now I'm going to list some of the big open questions in AI as a function of ALife. First, the definition of intelligence from a life point of view. What is intelligence? Is it the correct completion of shape rotations? If not, what is it? If we want to answer this question, we have to focus on intelligence besides neurons. For example, plant intelligence, or bacteria, or aliens. Second, the origins of intelligence. Now there is a big sub-part of ALife called origins of life research. This is the equivalent but for intelligence. Where does intelligence come from? What is in between adaptation over several generations and adaptation during the lifetime of an agent? Third, open-ended intelligence. Again, in ALife there is a big topic called open-ended evolution. This is the equivalent but for intelligence. Can we build agents that learn without being told what to do and that can learn all of their lives? 4. The role of embodiment. You are not a brain in a vat. How much does your body influence what you can learn? And exactly what is it influencing? I will give example of papers for these 4 questions, but here are 2 more questions. The pet distance question. So the pet distance is the fact that when you have a pet that you find very cute and interesting, and they do something you don't understand, your first reaction will not be to run and get a knife and cut them open to see how they work. If you give me any kind of neural network that does something interesting, my first reaction will be to open it and change what's inside. Can we make an AI that is so interesting and likable that people will not want to immediately open it? This might seem like a trivial question, but it's linked to very big issues. For example, can you make an intelligent toy that lasts for 100 years? Now let me tell you, 99% of the algorithms that you use now and call AI, in 10 or 20 years, nobody will care about them, nobody will know how to use them, the hardware will be obsolete, the functions will be deprecated, and just no one will find it interesting, no one will care. If you gave me a really smart pet, I wouldn't get bored in 100 years. So what is missing? When you think about this question, you focus on totally different issues than classical AI. For example, what does interesting mean? Can this toy learn things for 100 years? How do I make it not too reliant on human input? Even if you believe that it's only about emotions and caring, it's still pretty hard to make an algorithm that people have emotions towards. And 6. AI for biology and life applications. Can AI help us create life? Can AI distinguish life from non-life? If you are interested in that last question, I encourage you to visit this GitHub page, where Olaf Witkowski and I organized a fake life recognition contest. Okay, now for the papers. First, the definition of intelligence. This is way broader than most people imagine. For example, this plant, the Venus flytrap, can count up to 3. If you touch it just once, it will not close. You have to touch it 3 times. Does that qualify as intelligence? Just below, the Mimosa pudica plant has memories. It can learn which situations are dangerous and which are not. Is this intelligence? On the right, the Bocchilla trifoliata plant can imitate the shape of its neighbors. It can somehow sense the shape of other leaves, and then it modifies the shape of its own leaves to look like the other plant. Is this impressive enough to qualify as intelligence? Or take this famous video of a white cell chasing a bacteria. It can clearly make decisions, it has a goal, it moves around. Does this mean that you have little intelligence agents going through your veins? 2. The origins of intelligence. I recently found this very interesting paper by Geoffrey Hinton and Stephen Nolan. The paper is called How Learning Can Guide Evolution. And what they show is that when a task is very difficult to solve just using evolution, adding the possibility to learn can actually influence the evolution and guide it towards the right solution. I think it's a good example of motivation why learning on a lifetime scale could have evolved. 3. Open-ended intelligence. Open-ended evolution is not about can you evolve forever. It's about can you make a simulation that evolves forever and is also interesting forever. Not just evolving the same 3 things over and over. In the same way, open-ended intelligence is not just about can you learn forever, although it's part of the problem. It's more about can you get interesting learning forever? First, learning forever probably means that you don't want to be specifying the task over and over again, so the AI will have to decide on its own task. So the question becomes, can you get interesting forever learning without specifying the task? Part of the solution will probably involve finding the right reward functions. In this paper called Genetic Programming for Reward Function Search, they try to evolve the reward function. What we usually do when specifying the reward function by hand is to make the fitness and the reward match. And they find that on this specific task, the fastest way to learn wasn't to match the fitness and the reward. And it turns out that the best reward function gets close to a concept called empowerment. Basically, you want to reward the agent for having choices. Last paper about the role of embodiment. Much of the focus of AI is on the brain. We are humans, we like brains, but you can do a lot even without a brain. This robot is controlled through springs that you contract or expand, where each spring only knows how much tension is on it and has to react by contracting or expanding. They show that the gates that you can obtain using a central controller can be precisely replicated using a distributed controller without a brain. This is the end of my talk. I hope I could convince you that AI is a function of ALife, that it can be convenient yet stay relevant. It has a lot of convergences with mainstream AI, yet it has its own flavor. It's about more than neurons, more than brains, and more than humans. I hope we can move on from Raven matrices and instead focus on adapting to different environments and using the connections between these environments.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily.
Hi, Emily.
It's not even the next talk. Awesome. Thank you so much for that talk, Lana. That was fantastic. And you definitely convinced me that I should care about intelligence more than I do.
Fantastic.
Do you have questions for Lana?
If you have questions about plants, for example, just an example. Oh, question from Louis. Do I think that E. coli has individual lifetime learning? I actually don't know a lot about E. coli, but I remember reading that it can predict which kind of environment it will be in on a scale of a few hours and change its metabolism to adapt to this environment. So I would say, I don't know if it's innate or learned, but yeah, that's a hard question. How do you recommend ALife people get into AI? So if you're already doing ALife, I think it's easier for you to make interesting contributions to AI than the opposite, because you have a unique point of view already. And if you're interested in ALife, it means that you're interested in adaptation. So just make your adaptation not on the scale of generations, but on the scale of one individual, and you're doing AI. And it's harder for AI people to do ALife in a way that is original, because a lot of the ideas that we have when we're doing AI and we come to ALife, we have ideas that are very, basically the same ideas that everyone has. When we start, it's always the same. Do I know any project that combine plants and robots? Yes, there is in France a group called INRIA, the flower group, I think. And they have a lot of projects that combine robots and plants. For example, they try to manipulate the way plants grow by using robots that emit light in some directions. And there was also a long while ago a project from a different group where they had robot flowers interact with bees, and that was super cool. And do I have any projects planned by my own? Yes, I'm starting a collaboration with Dan Brickley on this Bokila plant because we want to know if it uses eyes to see other plants or how does it work. So in a plant with eye, that would be like really awesome, I think. Probably not, but who knows? Yes, Flora Robotica. Maybe I messed up the name. Either the flower group or Flora Robotica. I'm not sure. Luis asked a question about the paper. I don't think I will have time to read the paper. If you could say what you mean by this counts as lifetime learning. Okay, a question from Olaf. AI serves directly in the industry. How about ALife in your opinion? I think a lot of AI research is done almost as a parasite of the funding that we get from the industry. A lot of people do, let's say, two kinds of research. They do the research that gives them grants, and then in their free time, they do ALife research. That a lot of people I know do that. So I wouldn't say that ALife is very much steered by the industry. Adaptive sleep response in digital organism. No, that's two different people. Sorry. Do I think so? A question from Okasan.
Sorry, Lana. That was the information about the paper that Luis linked. You should read it all.
Okay.
It was both of us answering one after the other. So that is what that paper is about.
That is actually one thing. Okay. Do I think that adaptive sleep response counts as lifetime learning? Actually, that's a good general question is what counts as lifetime learning in general? Like, how would I try to find whether this thing is learning just because its ancestors were doing the same thing or whether it's actually learning in its lifetime? Of course, it's a very hard question. It's like innate versus acquired. I don't have an answer.
This discussion is great and I hate to cut it off, but we are 6 minutes past the start of when Luis's talk should be. So this is awesome. Keep this energy. But we're going to go to Luis's talk. Okay. I'm going to try and do it on my other monitor so that my Slack notifications don't bug everyone.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the summer school as much as I know I will be. When Emily asked me to record a short lesson on digital evolution, I thought, this is going to be easy. I've been doing this for a while. I've given overviews of this as part of talks before, but it turned out to be a real challenge for me. But it was a fun one. So here it goes, my 15-minute introduction to digital evolution. Before getting started, I think it's important to remember that the goal of science is to really try and make sense of our reality, which is this big, messy, organic mess, right? And we do that by trying to fit parts of it into boxes. And our boxes are never quite going to reflect the true complexity or a complete picture of reality, but by using different approaches and looking at different corners for hints, we end up with a better picture of what's going on as a whole. And artificial life, like any other field, is looking at things with a particular lens. And I will say that a defining feature of this community, though, is that the willingness to embrace sometimes strange or just outright wacky ideas. And doing so, I think, really expands the boundaries of the box that we happen to be looking within. And so instead of starting by reiterating what ALife is, I figured I'd let the person who actually put this phrase on the books introduce it. So
the field of artificial life is the attempt to capture biological phenomena such as self-reproduction, the origin of life, evolution, adaptation, growth, development, and differentiation in computers.
But I'm going to be talking about just one corner of artificial life, and that's digital evolution. And I'm going to start with the evolution bit, which can be summarized quickly, but don't let that lead you down the same path that I did and think that evolution is somehow sort of solved and easy and all figured out. That is absolutely not the case, and I spent a long time figuring that out for myself. But what it does mean is that evolution is a process, and we understand what the necessary ingredients are for it to occur, and those are adaptive evolution can occur if and only if there's reproduction, heritable traits, and variation in individuals' reproductive success driven by those traits. In other words, there's heritable variation that drives fitness differences. And if we have these three ingredients, then we can have evolution. And what this doesn't say is anything about DNA or RNA or the particular thing that is evolving, right? And that's an important insight and one that I think is sort of underlying much of the field of artificial life, is that evolution is a substrate-free process. It doesn't matter what's evolving. As long as it has these features, it can evolve. Now, for the digital part, I'm going to highlight some of the history that happens to run through my current institution, the University of Michigan. If you know who John von Neumann was, then you probably recognize his name as the inventor of the most widely used computer architecture, the stored program kind of method, sometimes called fetch, decode, execute, or the von Neumann model. But what you may not know is that he was working on building the sort of mathematical theoretical tools to describe self-replicating machines around the same time that he was working on the computer. And actually some of the first simulations that were being run on these very early computers were simulations of evolution. Now, one of the people that was working with John von Neumann was Arthur Burks, and he was recruited to University of Michigan to direct the logic of computer groups in 1956. And Burks had been working with von Neumann on this early computer, and Michigan wanted to sort of build their department, their expertise in this new emerging field of computers, right? And one of the first people that actually got a PhD in computer science was John Holland, and he was a graduate student with Arthur Burks. And John Holland really brought the fields of evolution and what was becoming computer science together. And one of his books, Adaptation in Natural and Artificial Systems, is really still a classic. And so are most of the books that John Holland wrote. I think they're just all fantastic and really dive into the theoretical notions of what adaptation means and how we can study not just sort of simple biological processes, but complex communities and ecosystems and social structures in digital systems. So he's definitely someone to be aware of. He also happened to train a lot of really fantastic luminaries in the field across lots of different fields, actually. So some that you may recognize, Stephanie Forrest. She's done a lot of work on these artificial immune systems, especially in sort of network security context, automatic programming and debugging, using evolution as a way of poking programs and seeing where they break. Melanie Mitchell, who's continued to be at the forefront of artificial intelligence and just kind of been an all-around complexity champion. And Eric Goodman, who's the previous director of the Beacon Center for the Study of Evolution in Action at Michigan State, was the first person to really take genetic algorithms, which were being developed as kind of this theoretical way of exploring evolution, way of kind of playing with toy problems in simulation, and apply them to real world problems when it would take, literal year to run these optimization processes on these computers that were, much, much slower than our current computers. And this is probably the only slide you'll ever see where Sparty, the mascot for Michigan State University, is on the same slide as the block M for the University of Michigan. But we still like Eric. So It's okay. And another one of Holland's student was Chris Langton. And we saw Chris just a few minutes ago introduce the field of artificial life. So he's definitely one of the forebearers of this field. He sort of coined the phrase and held the first conference on artificial life. So the first artificial life edited volume, the first proceedings of artificial life here pictured, was published with Santa Fe Institute, and Langton was the sole editor of that. But he was interested in developing these self-replicating automata, much like von Neumann was. And so that thread of interest we can trace all the way back to the origins of computing to sort of the more modern creation of the artificial life field, right? In the realm of self-replicating computer programs, a lot of the early work can be traced back to Core War, which was itself influenced by proliferation of computer viruses in the early 80s. And Core War was kind of this game. It was an arena where different people would submit programs to compete against each other in this simulated array of memory. And the programs would have to compete for that memory, and the programs that took all the resources of this computer, took more of the resources, would win. And what was really kind of cool and interesting was that pretty quickly it was realized that the programs that did this best were self-replicating programs. And this hardware had all of the necessary components to create self-replicating programs. And so those were the submissions to this competition that would win. And so this really kind of sparked the folks that were thinking about self-replicating machines and kind of evolution, and this led to sort of the next wave of, I think, digital evolution approaches. So the first one was Steen Rasmussen's attempts at building this kind of world where organisms could evolve and compete. And he took this Core War idea, and instead of having these programs be submitted by humans, they would evolve, they would mutate. And so you would replace one instruction with another. And this was a cool endeavor, but it turned out that evolution was really not able to make programs that could adapt in this environment. So you would quickly see the degradation of just disarray, right? These programs would not be able to replicate themselves after just a few mutations would occur, and things just were very brittle. And this was actually the same problem that folks like Chris Langton was seeing in his self-replicating loops, von Neumann would see in his universal constructor mechanism. So these were core problems with the conceptualization of these early self-replicating systems. And it was really Tom Ray, a rainforest biologist by training, that had a solution to this problem. And he built a system called Tierra, where instead of having brittle computer code, he took inspiration from biology and used instructions that were built around things like pattern matching or structure, instead of arguments that were very brittle to mutations. So I'll let him talk a little bit more about Tierra.
When I created Tierra, I hoped to start the evolutionary process in a completely alien environment and let it diversify like organic life had. And I'd hoped to see something as rich as organic life, but I thought it would take years of tinkering to get anywhere close. Instead, what I found is that once I unleashed it in the computer, it took off on its own and diversified and became very rich without any further help from me.
After getting really excited by this work that Tom Ray had been doing, Chris Adami and this crew of folks here in the early 90s decided that they wanted to build their own system, and they wanted it to be a full-fledged platform to do research. This was going to be a scientific tool, one that could handle experimentation and manipulation in a way that Tierra maybe wasn't built for at the time. And so most of these people you might recognize now. They're in the same order in the left picture and the right picture. And really, this tool that they built, Avida, became probably the most successful digital evolution platform. And I'm going to spend just a second or two talking about Avida in particular. So I'm going to show you a little animation that Charles Ofria made about Avida. And so this is a circular genome of one of these digital organisms, and it's circular just in the sense that if you keep going around it, you'll end up looping back on itself. That's a useful feature in terms of not breaking a program when you're trying to allow mutations. These are the kind of instructions that the hardware can recognize, so they're sort of simple assembly-like instructions, and they're executed on a virtual CPU. And this virtual CPU has hardware that allows for things like input instructions, which will take values from the environment and store them in registers or stacks. Here I put it on the B register. Pop will take a value off of a stack and put it into a register. In this case, it's going to put it into the A register because that pop instruction was modified by the NOP A, or no operation. Add will add those two numbers together, and output will take the value that's in the C register, the output register, and output it to the environment. And this hardware also contains instructions that allow the virtual CPU to jump to different locations. It also has so there's control flow, right? So there's conditional branching. You have read and write heads that allow instructions to be read from one location of memory to another location of memory. And if you put all of those components together, you have all the necessary bits to create self-replicating computer programs that go through their genome one instruction at a time, creating copies of themselves. Now, it doesn't have to be the case that that copy process is perfect every time. There could be random mutations introduced just by chance, and that introduces variation. And that, as you scale out to even bigger and bigger kind of zoom scales, you see these populations of different genotypes. Maybe most of these mutations are deleterious, but some of them will be beneficial. Some of them will lead to programs that are better able to copy themselves, to more quickly copy themselves. And those are the programs that are going to start spreading and taking over in the population, right? And so that has all the fundamental components of evolution, right? We have self-replicating, we have variation, we have heritable variation, and that variation is leading to differences in fitness. Now, these two self-replicating systems that were able to show how computer programs could actually evolve, they showed that evolution could occur not only when you had all of the necessary ingredients that we learned about in that Evolution 101 slide, but that there was this additional component that variation needed to be accessible by those mutations, that the system that was undergoing evolution itself had to be capable of evolving by random variation. And so this, to me, is a really fundamental insight about the nature of evolution as a process that was only really realized through these digital evolution systems. So to me, this is sort of like the basis of digital evolution. This is foundational knowledge about the world, right? But just like any other scientific field, right, we're just talking about one little corner. We're talking about digital evolution. And so I'm coming to this with a particular lens, and I've told you the history of one particular lineage through this field as it developed. There's lots of really cool other work going on. So I want to wrap it up with a definition. This is a general definition. What it means to be an instantiation of an evolutionary process is something that philosophers of biology have definitely discussed. I have opinions about, and so does probably everyone else in this summer school. So these are fun questions to ask about. And I'm going to end with just kind of a tour of a few different areas that I think are interesting and worth keeping your eyes on, and maybe some historical papers that are worth reading. So the first is thinking about these cellular automata systems. So you might have heard of cellular automata before. They're great tools for understanding complex systems, but they also found a home here in the artificial life world. And one thing that I think has been sort of kind of captivating recently is this system that Bert Chan developed called Lana. It's beautiful. It sort of extends the classic game of life into more dimensions and creates these really organic looking organisms that can replicate and just do really cool stuff. So I highly recommend checking these videos out. Another person kind of in this lower level approach to digital evolution is David Hackley. And he's done fantastic work, has had a long career in this field, and definitely recommend checking out some of his stuff. But I think most recently, some of his work in Ulam, and this idea of generating very simple, robust first ways of thinking about living systems is going to be really powerful and interesting. So this is work that I would definitely check out. There's another system that, along with kind of Tierra and Avita, has been relatively successful in the field of having lots of groups pick it up and do experiments with it, and it's called ALife. And this system is generally more geared towards understanding sort of existing biological systems in the sense that it's taking the model of DNA and transcription translation networks and genes and their organization on chromosomes and really digitizing that. So in some ways this kind of pokes at the question of what it means to be an instantiation of evolution, or rather, I guess, what it means to be a instantiation of evolution in a digital medium, sort of that whole phrase, right? And if that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. These are kind of fun philosophical questions to get into. Of course, there's also this whole other area of science where people are using genetic algorithms, evolutionary computation. Maybe you heard some of this during the artificial intelligence section. But artificial life and these kind of digital evolution systems are clearly related to this field. And so this paper gives a good overview of the history and where these different approaches kind of where they came together, where they diverged. And I'll end with this really fun paper that highlights how creative evolution can be. And there's even a YouTube video that shows a few examples of some of these surprising results that I highly recommend checking out. And I wanted to show this just because, well, not only because this is a really cool paper, but because the author list of this paper is a fantastic resource. These are all people that have done really interesting work in the field. And if you want to keep digging into digital evolution and this approach, check out these different people and see what they've done. I think this is a really, just the author list alone is a fantastic resource, but the paper is great as well. And I'm definitely happy to continue conversation. Hopefully this gives you a good jumping off point for the field of digital evolution. And let me know if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you for that fantastic talk, Luis. Yeah, applause.
Thanks. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, I'm gonna try and get us a little bit back on time track. So let's take a couple questions and then we can save more for the discussion later.
Yeah, and I'm around, so happy to just take them all on the chat. If you want to really get back on schedule, go for it.
If no one else
No, I
has
think we can
questions,
continue. Yeah.
Okay, related to the chat actually, what are the most beautiful examples of digital evolution that you've seen? Just in terms of raw beauty.
Raw beauty. Yeah, that's great. I think a couple of systems that have been mentioned already, I think like Carl Sims' virtual creatures from the 90s are not only captivating in the sense that they make you feel certain ways when you're watching them, especially the ones that start competing over food.
Did you know that he had an exposition in Tokyo, in a Tokyo museum, of these creatures that evolved, and people could choose, mutate, mix this one with that one, because it was just so attractive.
That's awesome. No, I didn't know that. That's really cool. I'm trying to think of other really, that one really sticks out, but it might also just be because it was one of the early things that got me really interested in the field, it sort of burned into my memory. Lenny is obviously just gorgeous, and especially the extended universe versions with just ridiculous patterns and really cool. I mean, biology is a pretty great example too of just an amazing amount of beauty and diversity, right? It's not a system that we created, but it's still cool. Even simple 1D cellular automata, I feel has just really beautiful figures that come out of it.
Especially the really colorful ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like some of these models of even things simple like bacteria colonies that are growing and have different sectors, they make these beautiful pictures and they look exactly like the colonies that you would grow if you had different fluorescently labeled cells on a petri dish. So it's really cool. Do you have a favorite, Lana?
Not really, but I did notice that among all of the research projects that I did, the most beautiful ones were about digital evolution. I don't know if it's easier to make something beautiful or it's just, I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah. It's this cellular automation uploader.
Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, spatial simulations, I feel always if there's some interesting dynamics and they're in space, you get beautiful patterns. It's just sort of pattern and interestingness seem to be sort of related, and space tends to bring that out.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, I think I'm going to suggest that we divert further conversation to the end of the session, just in the interest of not going too over time. Thank you so much, Luis. That was fantastic. Next up, we have Sam Kreigman talking about evolutionary robotics. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Let me set up my screen here. So I'm going to attempt to be able to see chat, but if I can't, honestly, feel free to interrupt if you have a question relative to the Slack or relative to this presentation. So I'm going to do it live. I'm sorry, but I think it will be recorded, so you'll be able to watch it later. Okay, let's see what we got here. Present. Okay, so my name's Sam Kreigman, and I recently moved to Boston, which is part of the reason why I didn't have time to pre-record this. My life is a little bit hectic right now, but I'm super happy to be a part of the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts and the Wyss Institute at Harvard. And these two institutes are kind of sit at the edge of biology and engineering, which is, I think, exactly where evolutionary robotics sits as well. So if you're approaching evolutionary robotics for the first time, some of the questions that you might be afraid to ask are actually the best questions that someone could ask. And if you're too close in robotics, you're probably never asking yourself, what is a robot? It took me actually a long time to make this slide or think about a good definition. So is a washing machine a robot? It's a machine, it's a technology, it has sensors, it has motors, does complex actions. But I think most people would say it's not a robot. And this is important also because there are going to be regulations for self-driving cars and autonomous robots. And you want these regulations to be built around a good definition of what a robot is and probably not include washing machines. There are arms that can perform useful work in assembly lines. And these are called robot arms. Most would call it a robot, but they can't move themselves through the world, which seems like an important part of a robotic device. And there are spot and other kinds of robotic quadrupeds. These have motors and sensors. Some of them, like this one, are remote controlled. So the extent to which they have agency, they're deciding which actions to take is limited, but most would still call that a robot. A wolf is a biological thing. It has sensors, it has motors, it's autonomous, it moves through the world, but it wasn't made necessarily through human technology, so most would not call that a robot. So here's my attempt at a definition. A robot is an embodied machine, perhaps machine should have been bolded here, that can move through the world and sense the world around it. And it's not something where something is or isn't a robot. Maybe it's more of a spectrum of how embodied the system is, meaning the ways in which it can move through the world and the breadth and depth at which it can sense the world around it. Okay. So that's my attempt at what a robot is. I think we all have a pretty good idea, though, when we look in the world and say that's a robot that isn't. Why robots? Well, robots can, in some cases, perform very useful work. They can perform jobs that humans don't want to do or too dangerous for humans to do. Whether or not they should be doing those jobs instead of humans is a serious ethical consideration that should be discussed, but don't have time in this talk. So we'll just talk about the benefits of robots for now. So they can, in some cases, perform useful work. They can also teach us about what it means to be an autonomous adaptive system, how locomotion and adaptive behavior and intelligence can arise. We can understand evolution and development in living systems through these model systems of robots. So robots can be used as a scientific tool, not unlike a microscope or telescope. So I'm going to skip what is evolution because making that slide, I was getting scared that was going to take the entire presentation, but I think you had a good introduction to that in the previous talk. So why evolution? Well, if you have a bunch of robotic parts and you want to make a robot out of them, for now, we're just going to say we're going to idealize these things as cubes, but they could be batteries, motors, sensors, just hunks of metal and plastic. You want to combine these parts in some way to make a functional robot that behaves in some way that is useful or is interesting to you, or can help you study adaptive behavior maybe in your lab. That could be the goal. For example, deliver a payload is a more utilitarian goal. So we want robots composed of robot parts that maximize the goal. Okay, that seems simple, but at the moment, there's no mathematics that exists to just tell you what your robot should look like. How should these parts be combined so that you create this perfect robot, or even just a good robot that satisfies this objective? And the space of possible designs that you can make are very big. So if you just have one robot part, which we're just gonna, again, abstract as a cube, imagine this cube can do anything, but it can only attach to other cubes on one of its 6 faces. If you just have one robot part, there's only one design you can make. If you have 2 robot parts, depending on how you count different structures that you can make with 2 blocks, you can make an upright column or a row. If rotations count as the same design, then there's just one design. If you have 3 blocks, you can make 2 different designs, this right angle or a row. Once you have 4 blocks, it starts to get a little bit interesting and more fun. You can play Tetris. There's also a few other designs that stick out of the plane. Then it starts to get kind of crazy. Even in this really simple situation, where you just have cubes, once you have a dozen or 2 dozen cubes, the space of designs is enormous. And we don't have good mathematics to really search the space analytically. And we can't just exhaustively analyze each design, even in simulation, and say which ones are good at being a robot, which ones are bad at the particular robotic task we picked. So evolution is one of the best ways we know so far to search the super large search space of possible robot morphologies, which means like their structure and form and body. Okay, so we have robot parts. What should my robot look like? You have all this robot stuff, and chances are you're going to design your robot like something that's familiar to you. Quadrupeds and bipeds have been studied extensively in robotics, and so that might be a good reason to make a quadruped or biped. And we know that a dog shape is a really good design when it's made out of dog cells and it's on a dog scale, and maybe it's in a dog world. That's a great design for this niche and the kinds of materials you're building with. But what if everything's the same, but you're building this robot out of plastic or silicone? And there's some kind of pneumatic actuation, and there's different kinds of sensors. Is the dog's shape still the same? Even if everything's the same, but the elasticity on one of the legs is slightly different, should it still have 4 legs? Should it still try to move in the same way? I'm not so sure. What if it's made of metal? What if it's smaller? What if it's super small? We're talking about like less than a millimeter. If it's like smaller than a grain of sand, should it still look like a dog, or maybe it should look like something else? Should it look like something else that exists in the natural world that's at that scale? Maybe. What if it's at the scale of planets? What if it's the size of like the continental US, which is probably much larger than 1,000 kilometers, but something really large floating in space? I'm not so sure what that robot should look like. And I don't think we have really good intuition about machines or systems that are going to operate in space or at the quantum level. What should these things look like? How should they move? How should they sense the world? I don't know if human intuition is quite there yet. It might get there one day, but for the moment, letting the computer decide and doing this kind of evolutionary process seems like a promising way to design robots. So what is this evolutionary robotics process? Well, in a nutshell, we're going to generate a random population of robot designs, so random ways to put together these blocks. And maybe you get some designs like this. You evaluate them either in the real world or in a physical simulation, which is just a computer program like we saw in the previous talks that normally simulates the world that you expect these robots to operate in. So it has like classical mechanics or Newtonian gravity and stuff. And you have some behavioral goal, like just move forward. That seems like a pretty important thing to do. If you're going to do some useful work in the world, you should be able to move. Some of these designs are going to move better than others. Delete the worst. Create a modified copy of the best ones. And replace the worst ones with those modified copies. Rinse and repeat. It's beautifully simple. You code it up in a few lines of code or just a few functions. And that simplicity, I think, is really important, especially if you're going to use these as scientific tools. So there's less confounding variables. There's still all kinds of hyperparameters. How big should the mutations be, et cetera. But I think it's easier, at least for me, to debug this kind of very simple code when I'm trying to draw general principles from these evolving robots and apply them to other systems, which is always kind of a dubious thing to do to begin with. So if you can simplify your model, that's always really nice. And so a lot of these systems have been done in silico, like digital evolution, in physics engines, because it's much, much faster to simulate something in a computer than in the real world, where you have to make a new robot every time. You can just run as many GPU cores or CPU cores you have just have a different robot design, evaluate it very quickly. And here are some of my favorite evolutionary robotics experiments using simulated robots. And these are often called virtual creatures because they normally don't escape the computer world. We will look at this video with Carl Sims' classic. If you haven't seen it in its entirety, it's a must watch. And I think that these kinds of projects involving evolutionary robotics, a good question to ask, and it's hard, and I do this with my own work, and a lot of times I'm not happy with the answer, but is how different is this new work than what Carl Sims and Jeff Ventrella did? And it's crazy, and like kudos to Carl Sims and Jeff Ventrella, because the work that they did in the early 90s, and there are some other people doing similar work, it was just absolutely incredible. They built their own physics engines, and it's beautiful work. Really, as a field, I think we've struggled to move past this, but there's been some progress. And I think the papers that I've outlined here, you can take a screenshot and check them out. There's all videos. That's the great part about evolutionary robotics, is that it's very visual, and watch the videos. And it's normally like a nice narration or some great techno music in the background, very enjoyable. But there's also serious science and engineering that's done in these papers. Okay. So what about evolved robots that have moved past the computer and into the real world? The classic example was Lipson and Pollock, which was published in Nature a few years after Carl Sims' work. And it was really basically moving Carl Sims' creatures into the real world using an emerging technology at that time of 3D printing. So we have some kind of design and simulation. There were a few different kinds that were actually built, and they were 3D printed as physical robots made of plastic, and they were hooked up to a computer by a wire. The motors were just snapped in, but the ball joints and the links of this robot were all 3D printed within each other. It's a very, very cool system. I suggest watching the videos for this as well. And then there's been work also with Lipson and his PhD student at the time, John Hiller, which made soft robots. And these things were built like out of these cubes we were looking at before, and these cubes are elastic. They stuck them in a pressure and air vacuum chamber and could actuate them, and they moved like they did in simulation. Then there's been 1D printed robots, which are pretty cool, and they're printed out like a paperclip, and the paperclip is bended in a certain way, and depending on how it's bent, it will push off the ground using different contacts and can shimmy across a bar that's elevated off the ground. The motors are printed right on it. So this was something that, instead of Lipson and Pollock's original work, which they had to like kind of manually snap together some of the robot, this more recent work automated the design and the manufacture of robots, but they're very simple. They're kind of like worms. And then some of my own work, we loosened this assumption that the robots had to be made out of robot stuff. So we just made we did the same exact thing. It's Carl Sims with biological tissues. So instead of building the robot out of plastics, we built them out of heart tissue in red and passive skin tissue highlighted green here. And one of the problems though, and that this work overcame, at least in part, all four of these and some others that I couldn't fit on the slide, was that things in simulation, when you simulate the world, there's going to be details or lack of details in the simulation. And if those details are not in the real world, then and the system exploits those details for behavior, then it's unlikely that it will exhibit the same behavior in simulation and in reality. And this is known as the reality gap. And it's one of the major challenges in robotics in general and evolutionary robotics in particular. And it was coined by Nick Jacobi at Sussex University in the early 90s. There's a bunch of papers. I just cited the journal paper here. And so this is a major challenge, and Jacobi proposed basically to randomize aspects of the simulation so evolution couldn't exploit those superfluous details. And that works really well, and it's been kind of rebranded recently as domain randomization or dynamics randomization. There's more sophisticated things you can do, system identification, so you can try to figure out the ways in which your simulated model don't match the real world. What are the most important details to change? These kinds of questions, I think, are some of the most pressing in evolutionary robotics. Most of the time, evolutionary robotics are the most simple examples. And if we want to make serious progress in designing more robotic, more embodied, more intelligent robots, I think we're going to have to grapple with this reality gap. So let's see, how am I doing for time? Why don't we very quickly dive into a little bit more concrete example. Go into dark mode here. I'm just going to talk about my own work because that's what I know the best. And so we just had two building blocks to play with here. It was skin, which in this case was passive. It didn't do anything, and heart cells. And these heart cells volumetrically actuated. They expanded and relaxed and contracted. Here's what those blocks look like in pairs. It was just easier for me to visualize what these were based on how they're simulated when they're in pairs, but the blocks are individual blocks. So this is like two blocks built into a little Lego bricks, and one actuates and the other is passive. So how do you put together these blocks to make something useful, even if your goal is very simple, just to move? There are some challenges here because we don't know how the heart cells are going to interact in new configurations. We know what they'll do when they become a heart. We don't know what they'll do in the shape of a dog. So it was challenging. We randomized some aspects of simulation following Nick Jacobi's cue. We create some random designs here. And most of the random designs that the computer puts together don't do much in simulation. The goal is to move to the right, and some of them break symmetry just by chance, and they kind of lean over to the right. And after many generations of trial and error and replacing the worst ones that don't even lean and don't do anything with the ones that lean a little bit better, and then the ones that actually take a step and then two steps or crawls, you eventually end up with designs that can satisfy this objective of locomotion into the right-hand side of the screen. And they do so in somewhat diverse ways. There might be a dog in here. Maybe that is a good design, but it's not the only one. And it might not be the most manufacturable. It might not be the best one for your particular case. So even just the diversity that's afforded by evolution, I think is really great. And so we had this one design, and like we saw on the previous slide, it moved in simulation. It had kind of muscly hind legs and kind of leaned forward. In hindsight, it makes sense. You have this stuff that's going to actuate, going to expand and contract in ways you're not really sure. So just have the thing lean forward and have two meaty back legs, and it will probably move forward. But this was designed by the computer. And then Doug Blackiston at Tufts built it out of real cardiac tissue and real skin or ectoderm taken from 1 day old frog embryos. So there's no differentiated cells in there. It's just kind of like a blank slate. The ethics of that should be discussed, but I think it's pretty good compared to other bio robots and bio hybrids that I've read about. So I feel very comfortable making robots out of just these blank slate frog eggs. But I think it's important to discuss what are the ethics of robots that are made out of different things. There's ethics of robots that are made out of plastics and metals when you put them in the world and then they pollute the world. So I think it's an important discussion to have, but unfortunately we don't really have time. Just to give you a sense of how small these are and how amazing Doug's work is, they are less than 1 millimeter across. And I've started to learn how to make these things, and it is so hard. It's so hard. If you watch the videos online, you just have to like take off this tiny little membrane around the embryo. Even that is so difficult. And yeah, a lot of respect to biologists that are doing their thing. Okay, so this is Evolutionary Robotics, and obviously highly biased towards the work that I'm familiar with, but I hope that it's of interest to you, and I hope that you'll come evolve robots with us, either in simulation or in the real world.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
That was super cool.
Thank you.
I think we've got time for a couple of questions.
Great. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't see the chat. I thought I was going to be more versed at Zoom when I was going in. So are there any particular ones that we want to bring up or ask from chat? Why don't you just unmute and ask if you have a question?
Hi. Yeah, I guess I put in chat, but I can read it here. So like, how do like regenerating robotics fit into this evolutionary like robotics field? Like, can different morphologies like help or hinder recovering from injuries? Whether it's this kind of like flesh robotic or like a actual like physical, more traditional robot.
Yeah. So one of the papers I showed on that slide with the virtual creatures that I liked was my own work, which obviously is biased, but I don't like all my work. I like that one, and it is about kind of regenerating parts after damage. And I think that it fits in. Regeneration is something that evolved, and you can evolve it in evolutionary robotics. And I think some morphologies are better or worse at recovering from injuries, and some control strategies or regeneration strategies work with some bodies and don't work with others. It's a really, really interesting question. There's different ways to regenerate, not just growth. You can do it by deforming a body. So one of the things that's nice about robots is it doesn't have to just purely recapitulate what nature does. There's other options. I think things like regeneration, development, reinforcement learning, I call all of these things evolutionary robotics. Not everyone agrees with me. If an evolutionary algorithm wasn't used to design the robot, some people don't call that evolutionary robotics. And we've had some heated debates about it, but I'm very welcoming of everything. I'm trying to just claim everything. Evolutionary robotics. We're all evolutionary roboticists.
There's a lot of questions about the requirement for locomotion and like movement, especially given like there's so many living things that don't I mean, they move, but I mean, so like plants and that sort of thing. So I don't know, talking more about that if you can.
Yeah, I love trying to come up with a definition of a robot, and my definition is not perfect. And actually, I hope that it's wrong in interesting ways. And so, yeah, a plant, a robotic plant, it moves on a slower time scale. But yeah, something that to us seems like it's basically standing still because it moves on such a slower time scale. It has sensors, it has motors, it's doing something in its own niche that's very adaptive. Yeah, of course, that's a robot. What about a plant that could also walk across the garden into a sunny spot and then plant itself again? To me, that seems somehow more advanced. I don't know if that's like motor chauvinism. I don't know what that is, but the more ways that you can move, sense the world, make hypotheses about the future sensory repercussions of your actions. This is all just defining like how embodied a system is in a certain way. That's how I would take that definition and say how much of a robot it is. But yeah, it's definitely biased towards animals. And yeah, humans have biases. I think things that I'm an animal. So if things are more like me, I think they're more smart. So this is totally biased definition. So that's a really good point.
It's really interesting to me because like, I mean, like with plants, right? Or like movement is very expensive. And so, I mean, there's trade-offs to it. I mean, do you think, I mean, it seems like there's trade-offs within robotics, right? Of like how much energy they're going to take and stuff. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So these kinds of trade-offs are really important. And they're things that are normally overlooked in the simulations. And one of the reasons why they don't always work in the real world when you try to build them, or they're not really feasible to build when you get a robot. Wow, it's so good in simulation, but you need like, you need the power of the sun for this thing to like jump. So maybe we're not going to build that one. Yeah.
I'd like to throw out just a minor thing about movement there. You said plants move, but slower. The difference between plants and animals is not really about speed. It's more about, I would say, separate a subset of movement called locomotion. Plants move, they wiggle around, they respond, they grow in different directions, but they don't locomote. And if you look at something like a sea anemone, which looks a lot like a plant, but is an animal, you do a time-lapse video of that, they're walking across the ocean floor, also very slowly. So that's really the difference. We have this intuition about locomotion in a robot, not just movement. But I was the one who posed the question, should that really be included? Because plants don't do that, but they're certainly alive.
Yeah, that's a great point. I like that distinction there. And I definitely think the most useful machine for a lot of situations is going to be something that might not locomote its body into a new place, even very slowly, but just grows. Whether or not or how much people are going to consider that a robot, I don't know. Something like self-healing or self-growing highway systems, or I see something about solar panels in the chat. There's definitely going to be technological niches that require something that's much more like a plant than an animal. And I think evolutionary robotics can still be useful in figuring out how these things should grow instead of maybe how they should move, what their base morphology should look like. I think evolutionary robotics is something that can be applied to non-locomoting technologies as well. It's harder in these simple systems to make a flashy video with techno music in the background of a plant growing, but I have faith someone will do it. It will be cool.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so it is 11:15, so we should probably stop here. Thank you so much, Sam and Luis, and Lana, but she left, for your talks. Those were all fantastic. So, okay, this was technically when our break was supposed to end. I want to give everyone a break to recharge and like be ready for the next talks. So let's take a 5-minute break and come back in 5 minutes at 20, whatever the hour for you is. Yeah, thank you all so much. This is going great.